Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this evening's panel, which we're very excited about, James Baldwin. This time, my name is Rich Blint. I'm the scholarly consultant for the festival. I'm also at Columbia University. The first thing I want to say, this panel is about Baldwin's New York, and it's not simply Harlem. It's also Baldwin's time all across the city, particularly in Harlem and Greenwich Village. And I want to begin this panel with a little epigraph that I started with the panel before, as one way to think about what's going on in Baldwin's New York. And so, in another country, which is all about New York, right? Uptown and downtown, Ida, Rufus, Vivaldo and company down, which is all about that kind of, as Aisha will say, Baldwin's New York. And I want to think about what the characters in this novel were attempting to do collectively. And so Baldwin quotes one of his famous or favorite kind of authors, Henry James, the person who said, did not believe in the myth of America, right? And so he says here, they strike one above all as giving no account of themselves in any terms already consecrated by human use. To this inarticulate state, they probably form collectively the most unprecedented of monuments, abysmal, the mystery of what they think, what they feel, what they know, what they suppose themselves to be saying. That's what's going on in another country, and I think Baldwin's New York is precisely about that. It's figuring out the shuttling back and forth between Harlem and Greenwich Village and his own struggle. So with that said, I want to introduce our amazing panel, moderated by Aisha Karefa-Smart, Baldwin's lovely, brilliant niece, Michele Wallace from the CUNY Graduate Center, Stephen Fullwood from the Schomburg Center, Thelma Golden from the Studio Museum in Harlem, and our lovely colleague, Patricia Cruz, from the Harlem stage. Please enjoy. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Baldwin's New York. My name is Aisha Karefa-Smart, and I'm very pleased, very honored to be here. It's been an amazing week. I'm full. I'm overwhelmed with the words and the images of James Baldwin, who is my ancestor and my relative and one of my heroes. And we're going to talk a lot with these brilliant people about New York. Often my uncle was associated with Europe, south of France, Paris, Istanbul, James Baldwin's global imagination, as the brilliant Rich Blint has often spoken of. But for me, he was the archetypal prodigal son who always came home, and home was New York. First Harlem, where he was born in 1924 at Harlem Hospital, where his 8 brothers and sisters, 3 brothers and 5 sisters were also born. But as he began to write and explore, he became a resident of Greenwich Village, of the Lower East Side, of West End Avenue, and when the royalties started pouring in, he bought a property on the Upper West Side on 71st Street, affectionately known as the Baldwin Building, where I grew up and was raised, where my lovely daughter Kali also grew up and was raised, and where we attended Baldwin University all day, every day. So, New York was it. He to me and my child's, in my mind and my imagination, he went off to France to write. And that was his writing retreat. And then he would come home and he would be at Michele's or the Russian Tea Room or at La Plaza, And I have an interesting story I'm going to share. His, companion, his friend, soulmate, Lucien Hoppensberger, to give you an example of my uncle being an OG. That's the original gangster. His Harlem steez came into play on many occasions, and he was interested in purchasing 137, but he knew better than to show up as the buyer. So he sent Lucien, beautiful, white, blue-eyed, down, to do the negotiating for the building, and purchased the building through that setup. So that gives you an idea of how his wit, his intelligence, his street knowledge, his ability to navigate the mean streets of New York came into play on many levels. And even his presentation as a gay black man. Don't want to mess with a gay black man from Harlem or from any place in New York, because you will get your behind kicked. And he could switch up on you in a minute. Very elegant, very gracious, beautifully articulate. But his favorite word was motherfucker. And you would get called that with a quickness if you messed with him or his. So just to give you an example of my vision of him is as the quintessential New Yorker, as a Harlemite, as someone who embodied the grit, the toughness, the confidence of a New Yorker. You know how we New Yorkers walk down the street. It's our personal runway. And that was him. And so I'd like to introduce this clip about James Baldwin's Harlem. And
I was born in Harlem in 1924, when it was a very different place than it is now. My father came from New Orleans. My mother came from Maryland. And if they had waited, 2 more seconds, I might have been born in the South. The first house I remember was on Park Avenue, which is not the American Park Avenue, or maybe it is the American Park Avenue.
Uptown Park Avenue.
Uptown Park Avenue, where the railroad tracks are. We used to play on the roof, and I can't call it an alley, but near the river. It was a kind of dump, garbage dump. Those were the first scenes I remember. I remember my father had trouble keeping us alive. There were 9 of us. And I was the oldest, so I took care of the kids and dealt with Daddy, whom I understand much better now. Part of his problem was he couldn't feed his kids. But I was a kid and I didn't know that. And he was very religious, very rigid.
And the wonderful Karen Thorsen is here in the audience. You can raise your hand, Karen. She passed you a ticket. And my Aunt Paula asked me to introduce her elementary school teacher, junior high school teacher, the wonderful artist Faith Ringgold is in the audience. Please say hello. She was a great influence on my Aunt Paula's becoming an artist, a designer, and her love of textiles and color. And so I was told by Aunt Paula to make sure I did that. And I'm expecting my Aunt Barbara, the oldest surviving sibling. But is she here? Oh, okay. She's not here yet. But we are going to begin with Michele Wallace, Faith's daughter. And the connection began back with Aunt Paula, back when you taught at 136. And then fast forward several decades to the publication of Black Macho and the Myth of the Black Superwoman. And Michele actually had a personal relationship with Uncle Jimmy and Uncle David. We'd like you to talk about that.
Okay. Well, it was a very special relationship that I had with him, and the opportunity that I got to meet him. I was so young. I mean, it was the fall. It was in 1978, and I think it was the spring, really. The book was written. It was coming out. I mean, Black Macho, that is. And I was writing a profile for him, on him for a magazine that no longer exists. It was a magazine called Viva. Mm-hmm. I think it was a women's magazine that was launched by Bob Guccione, the guy who did Penthouse. Mm-hmm. Launched this women's magazine, and I think his girlfriend or wife or whatever she was ran it for a while. So I was commissioned to do this piece, and I say a little prayer of thanks that piece was never published. thanks actually to the intervention of another author who's one of the few people that I would really like to meet, named James Allen McPherson, who was at the Atlantic Monthly then. Somehow or another, he reached out and stopped my article, and I'm glad he did. But because of it, I do these very extensive interviews. I transcribe the interview. I have this text of that whole experience. I met Jimmy at the airport. It was raining. We were supposed to go somewhere to meet a crew, but they weren't where they were supposed to be. So we took a cab to, you said the street address of the house?
137 West 71st Street.
137 West 71st Street, and I entered James Baldwin University that day. I was 26.
Wow.
I had written Black Macho, but I didn't know anything at all. And I cannot tell you the feeling of meeting him. I was, listening to you saying how loving he was. That's what I experienced. I actually, there were one or two good lines in my piece, and one of them was that it was one or two or three of the only times in my life that I remember the experience of total acceptance. Total, immediate embrace, acceptance, warmth, compassion. I said I was a writer. I was 26, and he welcomed me to the fold and began to instruct me and what my job was as a writer. Looking back at this material, I see that my education really, really begun then. And it was after that that I went to Yale. It was after that that I, the reviews battered me and people got angry.
Right.
He never did, by the way. He never did. And, the education, when you publish a book, when you know you have a book, when you publish a book, the public educates you. Right. If you're young and you should manage to get a book published that maybe should not have been published or whatever,
Right.
Your education begins, and mine begun. He was very much a part of that. And we're not supposed to be talking a long time.
No, you have time.
But I have, I loved him so. He took me to your house, and that was when I was embraced by your entire family. In my mind, there was this script about, James Baldwin lived in Paris, and he loved the United States because he was angry at it. And then I go there,
On 71st Street.
and children,
all over the place.
people, apartment doors open. I mean, just like a brownstone, but bigger than a brownstone. An apartment building, really. A little apartment building. And he stayed at his mother's house on the top floor. And we began this process of me being with him. Claude Brown came. All sorts of people began to drop by.
Right.
It was just amazing. And then I said, I want to hang out with you as much as I can.
Right.
So I came every day.
Right.
And I would bring him orange juice. He liked orange juice, fresh squeezed. I'd bring him orange juice, and then I would go all day with him until the wee hours at Michele's.
At Michele's.
He also liked the Ginger Man and Marvin's Gardens.
Right.
Do any of these places exist anymore?
No.
It's amazing. And what I'll just say this one last thing. The most magic time was the point at which they closed the door at Michele's as the sun was coming up.
Wow.
And they'd lock the doors, and then it would be just the folk. David, his brother, who I became very close to also, and the rest of the regulars. There was a guy who was a basketball player, former, and it would just be those people.
Right.
And it was like you were in someone's living room.
Right, absolutely. They converted
they always
everything
fed
to
me
their
at the
living
bar.
room. Yeah.
Oh my God, how much I lost.
Yeah.
How much we all lost.
Right.
But I guess, maybe there are places like that today, but it's not the... You gotta embrace change. Right?
But those were magical times.
They really were.
Yeah.
And that was a magical house.
Oh, absolutely.
A magic house. And when Jimmy died, David died soon after.
Right.
And for me, that was really
the
a
end
loss.
of
So
an era.
maybe I'll be able to come together with you all in Baltimore
Yeah, yeah.
and relive some of those memories.
And document the stories and tell the stories, those
absolutely.
important New York stories.
But I'm so glad I held on to it
Mm-hmm.
rather than pushing it out there before it should go.
Right, absolutely.
Because it didn't need to
right,
go.
Right.
You know, I can see that now. So now I read, because we're doing this, I read this. And there are so many things that he said that I now understand.
Right.
Finally, at
Right.
62.
Right. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
And, for sharing. And now we have Stephen Fullwood, who is a resident of Harlem.
Yes.
And also his work involves Harlem history, culture,
Yes.
and helping to preserve the wonderful history and culture of Harlem. And he's going to speak from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, because it's always a good opportunity to reread Baldwin, always, because you might read him the first time, like what I did back in Ohio as a kid, and didn't fully understand. And I remember at one point I asked myself, I said, well, maybe this guy isn't really writing to me, but he was. Baldwin is both a teacher and an ambassador. And as a teacher, what I just mentioned, you're rereading his work and sort of understanding how Harlem worked, or how he felt. Like, there are times when I reread The Fire Next Time and some of his other things, and the impression I got was that I was reading a slave narrative in some cases, because he left. He always returned, but he was trying to describe a situation that seemed to be unbearable through the Harlem Ghetto, which he published in 1949, in the Commentary, which was republished in 1955 in his first book of essays, Notes on a Native Son. But it's the ambassador that really kind of grabs me, because Baldwin did not invite me to Harlem. The Harlem he described looked like Toledo. Toledo, Ohio, where I was born and bred in 1966. And so the descriptions of Harlem that he gave us, the crime, the prostitution, the crowding, the policemen, this is what my neighborhood was starting to look like as I was coming of age. I've been living in Harlem for 14 years, and I've been working in Harlem for 16 years at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And over those years, I've reread Baldwin to get a better sense of the neighborhood, but also about how one thinks about home, how one thinks about freedom, how one thinks about the value of their lives, how you're fed on a daily basis. There's a really lovely story about a woman who apparently was looking at me the entire time I was in Harlem. And so go get my hair cut, or excuse me, my head shaved. And she walks up to me one day and goes, I remember you. You had dreads, you had an afro, then you had dreads again, and then you had afro again, and then you cut this, and this is how you look now. And now, I came on the current wave of gentrification. I'm one of those young black professionals that came in the neighborhood, and I came in with an outsider's perspective, thinking I knew something about Harlem, a place I never thought I'd end up being. And so the idea that one could be from somewhere and not be from somewhere is always very interesting to me. Baldwin was shaped in Harlem. He described Harlem very well. Some say that he took a biased view of Harlem. Some say he was talking to white people and that he was trying to explain the situation, and therefore he didn't code it with different, language. And if he'd been talking to a black person like me, he wouldn't have said all these things. But I disagree with that. And that's what I mean by rereading Baldwin over and over again, because you have to have certain pieces of information here and then you need to grab it and sort of knit it together to get a better sense of what he's trying to convey. And again, I go back to the issue of home, the issue of love, the issue of feeling as if your environment is crushing you. And this is basically what Toledo was doing to me. I knew I was going somewhere, but I didn't know I would end up in New York City. Even when I was researching the Schomburg Center and thinking about what type of career I wanted to have, I said Schomburg is the only place I want to be. I want to work with black materials. I want to work with African materials. I want to work with Caribbean materials. I want to work with like-minded people who value black life and its complexity. Schomburg is that place, one of many places like that. And so living in Harlem, walking at 5.5 blocks, I've lived on the same street for 14 years, in 3 different apartments, I was like, I like this one, I don't like this one. Can I live? Oh, okay, thank you. I live in this one now. So, looking at the different faces and the expectations of the people and overhearing conversations. In one block you can hear, oh yeah, Sylvia don't cook there no more. That's why it's no good. You hear that in one block. The next block you might see a young white male professional walking very briskly to the subway. Yet another block you hear a young woman go, they make my real bitches. I just be hanging with them. Yet another block, you continuously see people that you see day in and day out. And some people have been there in the morning, and you see them at night in the same place. So I live in a very, very dynamic time of Harlem, one that I recognize in the work of Jimmy Baldwin. Some of it I'm not too sure about because I haven't really done the research that I want to do, but it's home for me. And I'd recommend that, if you haven't already, to reread Baldwin and kind of consider your own situation. Because, as when someone told me once, it goes, Baldwin only wrote about love. I'm like, absolutely. Yeah. It was either the denial of it, or the embracing of it through his family, through the people he loved. And, my God, he was so prolific. He was so prolific. And this is really wonderful that this book is out now. So for those of you who claim to have read everything, there's some new stuff.
And it's on the Kindle.
And it's on the Kindle. I think the last thing I want to say is that
tons of stuff.
The issue of Baldwin having a biased view of Harlem is a very interesting perspective because, as I was saying to Aisha earlier, there's no one voice. There are always multiple voices.
Right.
And so the fault is with the person thinking that that one person is a spokesperson as opposed to that one person who may have been anointed or called to speak. And so with Baldwin, I think that he spoke for the voiceless, the folks who would never publish anywhere in the Commentary or the New Republic or any of these other places that he's had the privilege to publish and told their stories. And I think that's remarkable. And I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you.
And now we have the beautiful Miss Thelma Golden, who is the curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem and has a great charge and responsibility of housing many, many incredible works in an incredible place that has incredible history. And she actually was a student of my uncle's at Smith College and also knew him personally. And so we'd like you to speak about your relationship.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you. It's fantastic to be here in New York Live Arts for this Live Ideas, celebrating the legacy of James Baldwin. I think it's also fantastic to be up here with though this panel is Jimmy's New York, but to be up here with this panel with all these deep Harlem connections. So, in thinking about what I would say today, I really was thinking about Jimmy's Harlem specifically, but his and mine. And while, yes, now I have the privilege of knowing Harlem through my work as the director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Harlem that I really know, the Harlem that I have always known, really came to me through James Baldwin. I met Baldwin when I was in my second year as a student at Smith College. It was a time he was back in the United States to teach in the 5-college consortium, which included UMass, Amherst College, Smith College, Mount Holyoke, and Hampshire. He taught several courses, and there were many of us who were lucky to be his students, so I know there was a whole panel about this, and one a lecture and the other a seminar. The seminar was constructed really interestingly, very fairly, 5 students from each campus. And this being all competitive New England colleges, the opportunity to get into the seminar was considered to be like sort of 1 in a million. As a sophomore, not an English major, not an aspiring writer, but an art history and African American studies double major, I had to plead my way into one of the spots. When asked why, I don't remember what I said to get in. I can't remember that to this day. But I know that it sounded so urgent and so compelling, really, that I landed one of the coveted seats around what were mostly seniors, mostly aspiring writers, many of whom have gone on, of course, to be prize-winning writers. In this seminar, which always started a bit later than its appointed hour and went on many hours after, Jimmy spoke. It was ostensibly about American literature, but he spoke about art. He spoke about life. He spoke about politics. He spoke about love. He spoke about creative passion. He spoke continuously and eloquently in those big, long sentences about big topics while peppering these talks with amazing revelations about his own writing. While I soaked up every word, I said absolutely nothing for the first few weeks of the semester. I was terrified and made mute in his presence. Many of my other classmates, of course, knowing all of the things that interested him, came into the semester having read every Henry James, having read all the things that they knew he would talk about. But I just sat there, sort of waiting for the moment that possibly there could be something, anything, with my Very Smith College art history training that I could add. This changed, however, when he spoke a bit about Harlem. His writing about Harlem, which of course Harlem is a major character throughout, or the Harlem of his youth. In the midst of a paragraph, he would reach for a detail. He'd be speaking and he'd say something like, Jimmy would say, on Sunday afternoons, you know, the ballroom where there were dances, and he'd be reaching for the name, and I, in like an out-of-body experience, would say, the Renaissance. And I would be surprised too. And he would look at me, somewhat bemused. And finally, because neither of us could really understand where I would have the source of that particular knowledge. And then, as the semester went on, and of course he embraced us all individually with love, when I explained to him that my father, Arthur Golden, had been born in Harlem in 1926 on 7th Avenue and 135th Street, went to the same junior high that he did. My father remembered the school song, which he wrote. And then, that is why these are things I know. Now again, by the time I was born, my parents, who had married, my mother being from Bed-Stuy, my father being from Harlem, so anyone who knows New York, you know that means that we did not live in either of those places, right? Right? That was a big, big, big struggle, and so we moved to Queens. But my father did not lose an opportunity, of course, to drive through Harlem as we went over the Triborough Bridge coming into Manhattan. And he did not ever discontinue his talking about Harlem, the Harlem of his youth, which made it so that I understood this Harlem. Of course, I had heard all those stories while actively not listening to any of them from my father. So when, again, Jimmy would bring these things up and I could just, the Lafayette, I could name a street, I was surprised at how much I actually knew. This, of course, made me, at 19, begin to ask my father all of those stories very specifically, all those details that had washed over me, to understand the Harlem of that moment. Baldwin's Harlem, my father's Harlem. And it's a conversation that my father and I continue to this day. You know, as Jimmy said in the documentary, you know, that it wasn't the Harlem that it was. And I think all of us who exist in Harlem understand that. It is from this moment as his student that I began to see Harlem as mine, as my legacy, something deeply in me. It is that, Harlem, and also Buford Delaney, a story for another time, that I'm forever grateful for Jimmy for giving me, because it really charted my path. At the end of our semester in the class, he signed books for all of us. And I had him sign my copy of Another Country, because I was obsessed at that moment with Ida, along with Sula Peace, again, another conversation. And he wrote, as he was known to do, Dear Thelma, with an emphasis, underlining the Thelma, because he also found it very humorous that I had a very old-fashioned Black Harlem name. And he wrote, Keep on, keeping on. I went back to art history, which then led me back home to New York and led me very much back to Harlem. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm going to just throw this in. I was going to begin next with Patricia Cruz, who, as executive director of Harlem Stage, is they are responsible for James Baldwin this time being a year-long interdisciplinary look at the life of James Baldwin. So this began with Patricia, Cruz, and the wonderful people at Harlem Stage. I'm going to just slow it down a bit and read an excerpt that I was going to read when we began. But in the interest of time, but we have a little bit of time. So I just wanted to read, just to say I listened to my elders. Mr. Bill T. Jones suggested that I read an excerpt from Go Tell It on the Mountain, and we both happened to be revisiting the book after I read it maybe when I was 12 and maybe again at 20. I'm reading it again, and it's completely new to me all over again and very emotional, but I'm just going to pick up on all that's been being said, just a few words of how Uncle Jimmy writes about New York. In Central Park, the snow had not yet melted on his favorite hill. This hill was in the center of the park. After he had left the circle of the reservoir, where he always found, outside the high wall of crossed wire, ladies, white in fur coats, walking their great dogs, or old white gentlemen with canes. At a point that he knew by instinct and by the shape of the buildings surrounding the park, he struck out on a steep path overgrown with trees and climbed a short distance until he reached the clearing that led to the hill. Before him, then, the slope stretched upward, and above it, the brilliant sky, and beyond it, cloudy and far away, he saw the skyline of New York. He did not know why, but there arose in him an exultation and a sense of power, and he ran up the hill like an engine or a madman, willing to throw himself headlong into the city that glowed before him. Now that's Baldwin's New York, right? And we are going to begin with Pat.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And thank you. I want to say a word of thanks to New York Live Arts, to Bill, to Ren, to the partners who are participating in this, to Rich Blunt. I mean, we have become a bit of a family. And the family started with us at Harlem Stage because we were trying, as we do within our mission, to recognize, look back, and grab the iconic figures that have made Harlem Harlem. And we've done it through music, through literature, but there was no better place to do this activity than around James Baldwin. And for me, as much of the programming that we do, it becomes a way that I can really kind of self-educate, because it's not, it was not in my history. I did not know James Baldwin. I read his work, probably in college, and I didn't understand a couple of really important things that I want to talk about, and I'm going to come back to the idea of Harlem. I'm going to come back to the idea of New York, because I think it is, it becomes symbolic of some of the other things that he did. So I want to begin with the 1965 debate that he did with William Buckley in Cambridge. Because for me, he says, he doesn't begin with this, but he says, I hate to sound like a Jeremiah, but in fact he went on to sound very much like a Jeremiah. And I thought, here what we have is a prophet, not just a writer, not just an intellectual, but a prophet who, in the biblical sense, in the classical sense, reveals the sins and predicts the impending disaster, the final days of the kingdom. And it is my belief that he did that. And I'll go on to talk about how, and I'll go on to talk about why I think this is the final days. These are the final days of the kingdom. The first requirement of any prophet is to have sight, to be able to see who we are, to see one another, and to see ourselves. And James Baldwin did that in a remarkable way. He talked very specifically about the ghetto. He talked about Harlem. And of particular interest to me was the boundaries that he set were between 130th on the south and 135th on the north. And Harlem Stage sits right in the middle of that. So how appropriate to get the sense of what he saw and be in it now as it is changing, as if in a film. Because it's so rapid, it moves by you, and yet there are so many things that remain the same. And I think what he saw, and he reflected on that in the debate, was an almost, and this is going to be harsh coming from all of the love that we've heard talked about. He talks about what became almost a congenital hopelessness, a despair, which came from the realization, as he says in that debate, that nothing, you have a realization that nothing you have done or nothing you will do will change your being treated as less than human. That's a devastating insight. And I think we are living in the aftermath of that now. And if we don't acknowledge that, we won't be able to put a stop to it. And we have to put a stop to it. There's a bit of a contradiction for me that I found in looking at Baldwin, especially as he writes about right in Everybody's Protest novel. And he has trouble with and defies this idea of the case of Bigger Thomas being in that he cannot transcend his own categorization, and that becomes the transcendent thing that he cannot overcome. So he becomes the brute. And I think, in essence, we have, all of us, been seen as the brute, the other. For me, it's where symbolic perception takes over and tells your brain what you are in fact seeing. As an example of this, I was walking through Gramercy Park with my collie 30 years ago. My collie, the all-American dog. And a man stops me and says, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" And I thought, could he see that I'm from Chicago? Like Bigger arrived in Chicago, and that I would chop him into little pieces and throw him in front. Now, he didn't. I don't think he saw that, but I understood the nature of symbolic perception from that moment and through many others. What is the prophecy? It is if there is no recognition of the other, of the Negro as human, then there is scarcely any hope for the American dream. If the people are denied participation in it, by their very presence, they will wreck it. And if that's what happens, and if that happens, it is a very grave moment for the West. And I believe the Mayans had it right, that the world did end. We're just too arrogant to notice it. It's a slow demise. But I think we have to come to a realization before we walk off the cliff. And I don't mean to be the Cassandra to Jimmy's Jeremiah. But I think Brad recoiled at Brad Lehrman is our director of programs. He recoiled at that comparison. It's okay. He frequently does. But my concern is that with that, we will become the niggers, all of us, in this new oligarchy. We will be driven to ghettos, to gulags, while we will be, as Baldwin warned, subject to the tendencies, to the likes of the oligarchy that is now rising again as never before, and right here in America. This has been written about, it's been documented. This is not hyperbole. It is the cause of what we see when we see that one out of every three of our young men are in prison. And that prisons in cities across this country are being transformed from the high schools that they no longer need. So they're building prisons in the former high schools. This is a major tragedy. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the end unless we stand up as bravely as James Baldwin did. Because he was extraordinarily brave. And he spoke the truth. And I think unless we speak the truth, we will be at a terrible place. And I think that there are things that can save us. And whether we will be saved by the voice of Bessie Smith that you've heard today, or by the amazing grace as was written by the ex-slaver, or unless we are saved by the artist voices that we respond to. Voices like Carl Hancock Rux, like Stu. Stu will be on tonight. We are, Harlem Stage is commissioning Stu as a part of our ending celebration of James Baldwin to do a work in progress showing this evening at 8. Tomorrow, Carl Hancock Rux will be doing the same with a piece that he's written, Stranger on Earth. And I have grown to believe that I will be saved. I will be, in a personal way, by the visions of brilliant artists like Jimmy Baldwin, who can help to ground us, help us to hold on, so that, as he said, so instead of awakening, he said, we will awaken to the realization that the interior life is the real life. The intangible dreams of the people have a tangible effect in the world. So instead of awakening from the dream, it is my hope that we are awakened to the dream.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you all for your insight, for sharing so generously your personal stories, for bringing yourselves to the table and to the stage. Famous gathering place in our home at 137, and also in St. Paul de Vence, the welcome table. Thank you to Live Arts, Live Ideas, Bill T. Jones, your incredible staff, for really capturing the spirit of Uncle Jimmy. And, the air, the atmosphere is infused with his words, with his spirit, with his energy. Something has been rekindled. A fire has been relit.
Aisha, can I tell a story about Jimmy?
Absolutely.
That this is making me think of?
Absolutely. The fire this time?
No, not that.
No.
I was thinking about when you have an author who has so much work that you can have many Baldwins that people can read and see. it seems to me he died in 1987, so he was 64 when he died.
63.
63. I'm 62. I'll be 63 next year. And so we can talk about an early Baldwin.
Yes, absolutely.
And we can talk about a middle-aged Baldwin. We can't talk about an old Baldwin because he didn't live to be old. Right. But one of the things he said to me when I met him is, the first thing I said is, I'm from Harlem too.
Right.
And he said, well, where in Harlem are you from? And I said, I'm from Edgecombe Avenue. He said, oh, you're not from Harlem.
I don't know what this thing is about Harlem folk and
I'm about to tell you. I'm about to tell you, because he told me.
That's what I grew up hearing, too.
He said, you grew up on the hill. That's not
right. Exactly.
Now, but the thing about it is that's so ironic about it is I didn't know that my mother and my family came from the valley.
Okay.
I didn't find out until 1987.
And can you explain to the audience what the valley is?
The valley is below Edgecombe Avenue.
This
it's
is
divided
old
by this
Harlem,
colonial park. The valley was old black Harlem.
Right.
Because black people didn't occupy all of
Harlem
at once.
Exactly.
And so the hill, there was for some time a distinction between the two.
Absolutely.
White people didn't all just up and leave everything all at once. They and
little by little.
Jimmy also he writes about how the white people who lived on his block when he was growing up.
Right.
And when I began to talk to my mother, which I didn't even know that she was born at 222 West 147th Street.
Right.
I could have laid that on Jimmy.
Right.
I could say, man, my family is from
Harlem.
We're not from Edgecombe Avenue.
Right.
But I didn't know.
Right.
I didn't know
That
until
is
my mother
divided.
did this painting called The Street Story Quilt. And I took my dad to see it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He'd never been there before. And when he looked at it, he said, I said, isn't this a beautiful painting? I said, but what is this 222? What's that about? He said, you don't know, that's where she grew up. She grew up in the valley. 222 West 147th Street. And that's what Jimmy was talking about. It began a whole process.
Right.
Actually, that's when he died, right? 87?
Right.
A whole process of me talking to my mother about the real history of my family.
And it's funny that you mentioned that because I grew up, I think my Aunt Barbara is here, the oldest sibling. I think I saw her walking. Hi, Aunt Barbara. She's back there.
I don't think I know.
Thank you for coming out. 46. That's all I heard when I was growing up. 46 West 131st Street.
I wanted to know the address.
And that's the house. That's the old house. That's where they grew up. And my cousin Thomasina, I would say to her, well, I was in Harlem. I was up on on 147th Street in St. Nicholas. And she would look at me and say, that's not Harlem. And I just never understood.
I was so
But then the reverse has happened. The reverse has happened where I was speaking to a white woman. I was at a meditation retreat and telling her I was from the Upper West Side, which is an unusual thing because I often got told to go back to where I came from. I was often told to go back to Harlem. And I wasn't born in Harlem. I was born on the Upper East Side and raised on the Upper West Side. And because there weren't a lot of black people on the Upper West Side, I was often assumed that I was visiting from Harlem. But I met on a meditation retreat, and the woman said, "Oh, I'm from the Upper West Side too." And I said, "Where?" And she said, 116th Street. And I said, "That's Harlem." So like what?
That's right. It's all moved around again.
It's like 116th Street. That's not Upper West Side. That's Harlem. But we have these battles about what's Harlem, what isn't Harlem. But you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you brought that point up because there are people who have from old Harlem where there was a boundary, and Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, who unfortunately wasn't able to make that, talks about the different neighborhoods and the different boundaries and what was considered black Harlem or central Harlem and what was considered
Well, it had to do
Jewish,
with
Italian.
class. It
Yeah.
also had to do with class.
Right, class
That's
and
the
money,
thing you have to
yeah,
realize.
Sugar Hill
It
and
had to do with
Strivers
class.
Row.
That's right.
And so my uncle wrote from a very particular experience, a place, and a knowledge of a particular Harlem, you know.
But I think it was a knowledge that also was tied to a very important, significant generation of people
Absolutely.
raised in Harlem.
Right,
So it
absolutely.
really becomes slightly universal.
Universal,
right?
right.
In a way.
Mhm.
So that again, Art
Right.
Golden at 88
Right.
cannot refer to the Red Rooster as a Red Rooster. He has to call it the new Red Rooster.
The new Red Rooster. Thank you. Thank you. The new Red
It
Rooster.
You know, what's interesting is that for me now, trying to chart, sort of, I often say what's so interesting about Harlem, which comes out so much in Baldwin's writing, comes out in what he said in The Price of the Ticket, is that it's a place that people always talk about in terms of what it was or what it will be.
Right.
It's
Absolutely.
very impossible somehow for
Get
people
it in the
to stake in the present.
Right.
And that's something that I think Baldwin did so beautifully. He described a present.
Right.
He
Always.
described his present in Harlem
Absolutely.
in very specific ways that then you understand, at least for me, because of this personal experience
Right.
of my father's own life, you realize how much that present was very real, right, for many
Absolutely.
people.
Right.
So the geography that he traces
Absolutely.
in the descriptions in the writing themselves or in his
very
own
precise.
geography
Right.
of that, the other Park Avenue, all
Right,
those
exactly.
things
All that
really
stuff.
are the history that really lays the groundwork for the Harlem that we are all working in right now. It's
That's
all
right.
there.
And-
He laid it all out.
And it's why Stephen can say, when he read Baldwin and Baldwin's description of Harlem was Toledo, Ohio, because Harlem became the microcosm of Black America, of the various ghettos and neighborhoods around America. Harlem, people could read that and say that is exactly describing where I'm from. So it was very, very unique, and it's a witnessing
Yes.
of
And I
a
want you
particular
to-
time and place and culture.
I just wanted to add that Aisha, he emphasized the fact that he was talking to me about class.
Absolutely.
He made that
Clear.
very clear in a way that
Up
people
on the
didn't
hill.
do then.
Right,
People
exactly.
didn't do that.
They didn't articulate
Well,
the
they didn't
class
know
part.
enough to do it. And I didn't expect James Baldwin, because of what I had been told of, I didn't expect to be engaged in a conversation about class with James Baldwin.
Right,
What can I tell you? But that's what we talked about all the time.
absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. And we're going to open up to Q&A. And look, Karen Thorsen's here. Shut up.
6:27.
Thank you, first of all, for this. It's an extraordinary
Please take the mic.
experience to share vicariously, but I want to really use this moment to pay tribute to someone who did do some saving, and an artist who's no longer with us, and that's my co-producer on this film. The footage you just saw, Bill Miles,
Yes.
is that footage would not be saved unless he had, as a very young man, gotten a job with a film company, and his job was to take 16 millimeter fill and just put it as leader. It's just filling gaps in between what's supposedly the real footage. And he held it up to the light, and he saw images of Harlem, and he made it his life mission, and he spent years, and the result is a 4-hour series called I Remember Harlem. And Bill died this past year, but May 12th of 2013. And it was an honor to work with him. This film wouldn't exist without him, and all those memories of Harlem wouldn't be here.
How stunning it was.
Thank you all for an incredible panel. I was wondering how you guys were going to go south to Greenwich Village in this conversation. We stayed in Harlem the whole time.
Yes,
And so we should take a moment maybe to kind of think about that. Baldwin said in Here Be Dragons about how he was menaced both in Harlem and in Greenwich Village by the police, by his sissified self. And how do we think about the fact that Harlem now, we do brunch all the time these days, right? And I was on 116th Street and I saw 6 white homosexual couples walking hand in hand on 116th Street. And I can't do that right now, because I know folks in the neighborhood. But more than that, they would say something to me, and I would respond. But what I'm saying is, he talked about getting beat up.
Right.
That's right.
In both places.
Right.
But can we talk a little bit beyond the kind of, Harlem has an incredible tradition. But can we talk a little bit about the complexities and the contradictions of a Harlem that wasn't wholly accommodating to Jimmy Baldwin? And neither was the Greenwich Village.
New York was a minefield.
It really was for him.
Well,
and for all of us.
Well, one of the observations that I had growing up and watching my uncle, and very much in my own mind, because I wasn't born in Harlem, but I was raised by people from Harlem, so I laid claim to it. I was always very proud of that heritage. But I think it was him being born and raised in Harlem and surviving, and keeping people off of him, and not getting beat up, and had something to do with the way he moved in the world and the way he presented himself. And so there was this dual consciousness. He was a gay black man, but he presented himself, and he held himself in a way that was like, because he had to in order to survive, in order to walk the streets of Harlem and not be set upon by his own people.
Both young and old.
Well, both young and
he
old.
talked about being propositioned by men and women.
Absolutely. In the church and out of the church.
So I guess what I wanted is complicate the narrative of Harlem, but also what happened to him in downtown.
Downtown as well.
But see, that's the word. It's complicated.
Yes.
It really is. I mean, I'll throw out some few other things. It's the time. It's white privilege. It's all these different things. When I first moved to Harlem in 2000, May of 2000, a year later, there was two black men were walking down the street and got beat up by a group of men. One went to the hospital. I don't really even know actually what happened after that. GMAT moved just east of Harlem, Gay Men of African Descent, founded in 1986 to support black, gay, and Latino men. But as I'm walking down the street now, you can see all different types of expressions of queerness when it comes to black and white men, as well as lesbians, men, females as well. And somehow the idea that you look gay is still stuck in most people's heads.
Right.
That's the first thing. So this notion of more visibility, we're just talking about the times when people are dressing in a particular way, because it's always been there. For someone like Uncle Jimmy.
Right.
I can't call him Uncle Jimmy.
Yes, you can. I got the whole world calling him Uncle Jimmy. It's all right.
Effeminacy is equated with homosexuality.
Right.
But I've lived in this neighborhood, like I said, for 14 years, and I'm seeing all these different dynamics play out around class, around, like I said, white privilege, and I do hear people saying things. But I'm also thinking of Harlem in different places. It's not the neighborhood it used to be. It feels very transient. It feels like, people are moving in and out a lot, And so I think it has a lot to do with the time.
The time.
And it needs to be complicated because, Harlem is not those 10 blocks.
Right.
It's a little bit over here, a little bit over here.
And of course, the village has completely changed.
That's absolutely. The village is hardly gay anymore, too. So, I mean,
well,
we have a Chase and we have a Dwayne Reed on every corner. But, the
That's
cultural,
right.
I tell people I live in business New York. Business New York.
Right.
If you're an artist, you have a hard time making it here.
Yeah.
You have to go live somewhere else and then come into the city and, do your art. So it's a different time.
I think what he was talking about was before NYU took over the village.
That's there,
When you could walk through there and get at Washington Square Park and get beat up because you were gay or but you can?
Yeah.
But for a while it was a drug park, a needle park.
It's still a needle park.
Yes.
It's all those things. It's everything to everybody.
The more things change, the more things stay the same.
Yep.
But I think, Rich, also something else you bring up that Baldwin complicates is the way in which Harlem, let's think of Uptown, and Greenwich Village downtown were such a complex cultural scene, right, for black artists in that period and continuing. This is something Bill T. Jones and I have talked about, right? This idea of how an avant-garde places itself and where it can be. And Baldwin was one of those figures that had ties right?
Right.
In both places,
Mhm.
had roots in both places.
Mhm.
They came in the work in really profound ways. And I think that still speaks to many artists, this idea of how you mix your cultural heritage and your artistic heritage together, that sometimes these geographies mean something. And I think Baldwin really, really, really explored that and spoke about it throughout his career and his life, adding Europe, right, into that. Let's,
Right.
you know, sort of
Yeah.
up, down, you know, all the different experiences, uptown, downtown,
Right.
and the experience of the expatriate.
Right, absolutely.
Hi. So I've been here for all of the events, and two of the two major focuses of almost every discussion, for I guess obvious reasons, fall onto race and sexuality. And for me, Baldwin really originally spoke to me as an artist. In that book you grabbed, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity is my favorite essay in my Holy Scripture, and that's always stood out to me. And so I've always, and since being here, I've been very curious about the other aspects of his commentary. And so you mentioned class, and I really want to know a little more about that, kind of the conversation and the commentary and where that went.
Well, only that, I don't know, being black and growing up in New York, to me, class was very complicated. And, you know, I spent a lot of my life, I still really don't know what class I'm supposed to be. Because I grew up in Harlem and I went to a private school, and, you know, there's the Hill and the Valley and Sugar Hill, and there's the Harlem of the 30s and the Harlem of the 20s, and Jacob Lawrence's Harlem and Jimmy Baldwin's Harlem. It's wonderful what Thelma and others are saying about the way in which he plotted the terrain. Because you could actually read James Baldwin to revisit the map of New York and to study the changes,
Right, absolutely.
including the addresses we've added today and the bit about, what's the street again? It's
71st Street.
71st Street. I just am really dying to go and see what's there now. You know?
Oh my God, it looks like a mall, strip mall, the whole.
I mean, it's just
Columbus
so crazy.
Avenue.
But the point is, as a young person, you know, it's like reading Dickens or Thackeray or Henry James about London. You can actually use it to look at the history of the city. You've got Miles's, I'm so glad Miles was able to save footage of those times, and to get into thinking about when the footage was made, how it corresponds to what was said. The 20s were different from the 30s, were different from the 40s, were different from the 50s. And Jimmy, all I can say is he really recognized that. He acknowledged that. You know, he would tell you every conversation we had, I'd say something about Atlanta or Boston. And I'd say, well, Atlanta's integrated. He'd say, well, no, it's not. You know, I mean, this is, you know, getting better. No, it isn't. We had intense conversations about Boston. He had the map of the world in his work and in his ideas. If you even go back to Notes of a Native Son, that thing he wrote about that village in Switzerland where he stayed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just treasures
Yeah.
there everywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, he always wrote about class in France.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look for it, you'll find that he always does.
Right. Did you have something to say?
Just one
Yes.
point of information.
Yes.
Another of our partners, the New School,
Right.
the Vera List Center,
Okay.
is talking about doing a mapping.
Okay, that would be
And so
A
great.
I think
mapping
it's
would be
important
good.
for us
A
to
mapping would be good.
make note that it's really a broad
Broad.
partnership. It doesn't. It begins here. It will end at Harlem Stage, but there are a lot of points in between at Columbia,
A
at
mapping
New
would be
School.
good.
So we're engaging a lot of
Columbia's
people
so
in
good
this.
at that.
So that's
Right.
a part of it.
I just want to say, I think that when it comes to the issue of class, in America, it's always about where you're at. And Baldwin once said that people need to know where the bottom is. So the two words that you learn are nigger and freedom when you come over as an immigrant. So you really need to think, I think of class all the time. Because like you, I'm like, I went to college, I did
Right.
this, but I
Right.
came from a poor family.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I come to the realization that it's about where you're able to move, where
Right.
you want to land.
Right.
There are people who have no money, very bushy.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're interested in being over there, away from the niggas.
Right, exactly.
So when I read Baldwin, that's one of the
And
lenses
some
I
of them
look
are
at.
black.
Right.
Some of them, and I think that I just think it's clear that when you read any literature, it's like, I remember when we were doing a talk about Giovanni Schomburg, someone said it was really great for Baldwin to write about, well, he didn't write about race. And I was like, what?
Right.
So black means race?
Right.
And so, like, I definitely encourage you to reread and rethink, you know, the way you read these novels, because they're always about class. They're always about race. They're always about where you want to land or where you are stuck.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So,
I just, I'm
It's a wonderful
I
thing.
was really right, but I really was curious about like the conversations. You know what I mean, in terms of not just the writing, because the writing expresses so much, but there's so much more in a conversation.
Yes, there is.
You know.
You're right.
Absolutely.
My
I'm going to
question,
get it out there.
my question is for Aisha, and it's about a vignette of Baldwin's New York that I think that you're in. And I've been really curious about it and desperate to be here. And I'll just say that I drove 14 hours from Urbana-Champaign from the University of Illinois to be here. And it's because I hope to bear witness to the shame that you can earn a PhD at a Big Ten land-grant university without studying or writing about James Baldwin.
Absolutely.
So I write about the evidence of things unseen, and I'm trying to tie the way that he looked at the Atlanta child murders to Trayvon Martin.
Right.
So there's a vignette in the Playboy article, which was 1981, that drops out of the book. And I believe it's about you as a little girl. And he talks about being at the residence at the Baldwin building. And I believe your mother and her husband helped him with editorial work and, going over ideas and whatnot. And there were two girls that he referred to as his nieces that just didn't want to have anything to do with that adult nonsense. And you left the house and you went down to the Hudson River to pick flowers for your mom.
Okay, I'll tell you who that is.
But I just wanted to say that reading that and the harrowing suspense of the backdrop of the disappearance of the children has plagued me at that time with nightmares. And so I was so thrilled to be able to just come here, but I'm just dying to ask you
so
about
much.
your perspective as that girl.
Okay, thank you so much, and I have to tell you that it wasn't me, because I was the one who was always in the adult business. I was, whenever Maya and Tony and all of them were talking, I was hiding somewhere trying to get up in the conversation. That would have been my older sisters. I have 3 older sisters, Carol, Cheryl, and Lynette, and the story is because of what was happening in the climate at the time. And my uncle was heavily surveilled, over 800 pages of FBI files. The family was afraid for his life. He had lost his friends, Malcolm, Martin, Medgar. These were people he considered his friends. And the family was afraid that he was next. So when my sisters, we lived, on 71st Street, and Central Park to the east was our playground, and Riverside Park to the west. We often went to Central Park and played and picked flowers or whatever. So when they disappeared, panic set in because they thought that they had been taken. So, but I thank you for making that trek. It wasn't me. I came later, but I know the story well because for many, many years, up until recently, the family was traumatized by that period of time, and my uncle was such a vocal spokesperson on behalf of the civil rights movement, but human rights, really, that we often lived in fear of something horrible happening. And it still impacts especially the older generation today. You just don't get over that kind of trauma ever. So, but thank you for bringing up that story.
Yeah, as we close this panel, I think it's important that everyone knows that on James Baldwin's birthday, August 2nd, we will be putting his name in the street.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Is Trevor here?
It's an initiative led by Trevor Baldwin. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, because
So Trevor Baldwin, Baldwin's nephew, has launched a campaign with Community Boards Uptown to get 127th Street between 5th and Madison renamed for James Arthur Baldwin. on the day of his 90th birthday, August 2nd of this year. We're working with Rosa Rivers, the National Black Theater, the Apollo Theater, to do a major event on that day. It's overdue.
Way overdue.
Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us. See you at Stu downstairs.